Hello, hello, and welcome. I'm Meron Khalili. We're DiEM25, a radical political movement for Europe. And this is another live discussion featuring subversive ideas you won't hear anywhere else. And tonight, once again, we're focusing on Palestine. We're nearly 20 months into a live streamed modern variant of what experts across the board call a genocide in Gaza. Key Israeli ministers have publicly called for the Strip's total destruction and the removal of its people, and Israel's ongoing campaign is executing that vision, wiping out entire families, bombing shelters and schools. For 3 months, Israel has imposed a new siege, and famine is spreading. Harrowing doesn't even begin to describe some of the images that are coming out of Gaza, and this will go down as one of the greatest crimes of history. And yet, something is shifting. Some Western leaders and high-profile commentators who are not on the left are making critical noises on Israel for the first time. France, the UK, and Canada jointly branded Israel's conduct intolerable, unacceptable, and wholly disproportionate. Establishment flagship papers like the Financial Times, The Economist, The Times, and The Washington Post have followed suit, their editorial boards urging hard leverage on Israel. And even former Israeli prime ministers like Ehud Barak and Ehud Olmert now call the Gaza assault criminal and say Netanyahu belongs in The Hague. And lastly, the optics for Israel are terrible. A fresh Pew poll finds Israel viewed unfavorably in 20 of 24 countries surveyed, with numbers collapsing among young voters in the West. So what's really happening in the ground in Gaza and, of course, in the West Bank, where we just saw last week that Israel has announced the construction of 22 new settlements? Why has the international reaction up to now been so muted? And are these recent cracks real or cosmetic, or is it too little, too late? And what has to happen next? What can we, as active, engaged citizens, actively do about all this? So we've got a great panel for you tonight. We've got Mohammed Al-Kurd with us. Hey, Mohammed. He's a writer, organizer, one of the most outspoken and unapologetic Palestinian voices out there, and the author of the new book, Perfect Victims. And of course, our own Yanis Varoufakis. And you out there, if you've got thoughts, comments, rants, things that you would like to get off your chest about Gaza, I'd like to put them to our panel, Gaza, Palestine, the West Bank, Israel in general, please put them in the YouTube chat and we'll put them to our panel. Let's kick it off with Yanis.
Thank you, Maron. Thank you, Mohammed, for joining us today. It's so important to have your voice. It's so important to keep drumming away at what is happening in Palestine. We keep saying that, and it has never been said enough, however, that what's going on in Palestine today is the great ethical clarifier of our time. The position that people have taken, either complicitous with the genocide or opposing genocide, is going to stigmatize or mark them forever. There is no doubt that in a few years' time, in a decade or so, everybody will claim, in the same way that now they're claiming that they were against apartheid in South Africa, they will claim that they were against the genocide of the Palestinians. But of course, that doesn't matter. What matters is the ethical stance, the political stance that people take today. Maron, you mentioned the sea change. There has been a sea change when it comes to the official position of the Western establishment media. But the sea change which is taking place in Palestine, in Gaza, in East Jerusalem, in the West Bank, is exactly in the opposite direction. Misanthropy and barbarism is galloping. It is being reinforced on a daily basis. Now we have this new outfit of American mercenary pseudo-humanitarians, what is it called, the Gaza misanthropic, they call themselves humanitarian agency or whatever. And they are simply the humanitarian wing of the genocidal IDF. They're luring Palestinians to particular spots in order to shoot at them. They're luring them with food. At the same time, Mohammed is going to tell us a lot more about that. In East Jerusalem, in West Bank, there is the ultimate proof that Israel is lying through its teeth when it says that the problem is Hamas. The problem is Jerusalem is not Hamas. Even if Hamas simply did a disappearing act, the genocide, the ethnic cleansing would continue in the same way that it was going on very well before Hamas came into being. So, one last word before I invite you, Mohammed, to brief us and to you know, state your case, as you must, as we all must. This sea change in the establishment liberal media and some conservative media, I very much fear that it's a smokescreen. I very much fear that it is a tactical, not a strategic change. I noticed that 10 days ago or so, I was in England and I was debating in a book fair with a former Tory minister who was a staunch Zionist. He remains a staunch Zionist. And I noticed that on the same day that the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, on the same day they all started being critical of Netanyahu. So was he. But my, if you want, interpretation is that they are tactically criticizing Netanyahu. They call the massacres, the starvation, the what is a genocide. They don't call it genocide, but they call it intolerable for one reason: to shield Netanyahu and to shield Israel from what really would hurt, would be a total embargo, not just on weaponry, but complete sanctions, commercial sanctions, financial sanctions. They are trying to avoid that by conceding that Netanyahu is a killer. They are shielding him by turning against him in words in order to make sure that the world is not, well, at least the West, doesn't turn against Netanyahu's government in practice. Let us not forget that this monstrous lie about the West being committed to the two-state solution is hiding the fact that they have been complicit and they have been totally supportive of the one man whose life project is to kill any possibility of a two-state solution. So the complicity and hypocrisy of the Western press, Western governments, especially those ones who support supposedly in words, but certainly not in deeds, the two-state solution. This is long-standing. And it's going to continue even when Netanyahu is out of the picture, because at some point Netanyahu is going to be out of the picture. But let us not forget that the crushing majority of the Knesset, with the exception of our comrade Ofer Kasif and maybe one or two other people, they are also in the business of denying Palestinians the right to exist, denying that there is a people called the Palestinians. Essentially, the so-called Israeli peace movement has disappeared. More or less. It's shrunk immensely. And at least when it comes to its representation in the Knesset, you have not just a genocidal government, but you have a genocidal regime. And the liberal establishment in Europe and in Canada, in Australia, in the United States, in the West, are simply in the business of shielding them through some harsh words that they're uttering. At least that's my view. I would like Mohammed to comment on that, but Mohammed, don't feel constrained to talk about whatever it is that I have said. Feel free to share your perspective with us.
Mohammed, your reaction, please, to what Yana said.
I think you absolutely hit the nail. First of all, it's a real pleasure to be with you here, and it's a real pleasure to be among all those who are listening to us. I think you had the nail on the head. There's, I think, a coordinated effort, and this is really expected and almost played out. And we've seen this throughout every single Israeli assault on the Gaza Strip, be it in 2008, 2014, or the various multiple assaults on the West Bank and the occupied part of the eastern part of occupied Jerusalem throughout the years, is that there's an attempt to pin the blame on Netanyahu. There's an attempt to reframe genocide as a one-man show, whose responsibility falls on Netanyahu's shoulder. And we forget that Netanyahu is elected time and time again democratically by the Israeli population. We forget that Netanyahu is upheld and supported by an entire regime and establishment that is genocidal. And there is a whole system responsible for this genocide. It is Zionism. And I think what is happening so far and wide, be it in the mainstream media landscape or in Western governments around the world, is that there's an attempt to rehabilitate Zionism. There's an attempt to save Zionism from itself, from its own actions. But the world is reaching a fever pitch, and surely, maybe procedurally and institutionally, things have not changed much around the world. But in terms of public opinion and in terms of the populist sentiment, the world is turning against Zionism, and we understand now that it must be abolished. A recent poll that was released, I think 2 weeks ago, showed that 82% of the Israeli public believes in the ethnic cleansing and the forcible displacement of Gazans in the Gaza Strip, and 47% believes in killing every man, woman, and child. 47% of the Israeli population. But we also need not to look to polls to understand this, because the Israeli policy, the official Israeli policy, indicates that this is actually the sentiment that is widespread inside the Israeli society. Their actions speak much, much louder than their, words. And I think this brings to mind, a kind of discrepancy that I'm almost amused by, if it weren't so grim and morbid. If I'm almost amused by in the West, is that Western leaders, Western representatives are fine with displacement and dehumanization being the policy and procedure of the Israeli government. They're fine with the Israeli government raising and destroying and dismantling Palestinian life. But as soon as an Israeli politician comes out and says the quiet part out loud, somehow it's an international or diplomatic crisis. And what this has allowed is that as long as Israelis can be polite or diplomatic in the way they operate on the global stage, then everything continues to be business as usual. It's almost like we have to show a little gratitude or a little thanks to Israeli ministers like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who are so rancid and so blatant in their Zionism and their anti-Palestinian racism. But like you said, the story, it doesn't begin or end in Gaza, and it's a tough question to navigate, because in Gaza you have people who are incinerated alive by Israeli warplanes every single day. We're hearing that every 40 minutes there's a new Palestinian child who is killed in the Gaza Strip. So it almost makes the struggles and the battles that are being waged on Jerusalem and on the West Bank almost seem trivial and futile. But we know that they aren't, and they're not only a matter of violations of human rights, but they are ultimately and essentially a battle over the true essence and the true identity of Palestine, or what remains of Palestine. If I am to zero in on Jerusalem, for example, way before October 7th, we've had various techniques of ethnic cleansing at hand. I'll speak a little bit about my own neighborhood. For example, I grew up in a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah that sits between West and East Jerusalem. And ever since I was alive, we've had cell organizations, many of them registered in the US as charities, sue our families and say that our houses are theirs by divine decree. And of course, they collaborate with the Israeli government and Israeli military to displace us and dispossess us of our homes. But this is not the end. This is not the ceiling of this kind of ethnic cleansing scheme. In Silwan, which is just 10 minutes away from our house, you have Palestinian homes now that are at the risk of demolition because, quote unquote, they were built without permission. But if you peel a little bit behind, or if you look behind the headline, you would realize that the Israeli municipality rejects about 94% of building permit applications submitted by Palestinians. If you go just a little bit, 10 minutes out of Silwan, you go to Isawiya and you see that the community is deprived of its natural growth because it's surrounded by what the Israeli government labeled as natural resources or environmentally protected areas. But again, if you peel behind the headline, you would realize that all but 10% of land within so-called Israel has been declared to be state-owned. And this is for the sole purpose of expelling community growth, depriving communities of natural growth. Obviously, there's a lot to be said about settler violence in the West Bank, about the targeting of Palestinians, fighters or otherwise, all over Palestine, all over historic Palestine. What's most grim to me, and I'll end on this point, I'll end on this note, but what is most grim and heartbreaking to me is that after maybe 60,000, if not 100,000 Palestinians dead, killed, martyred, everything has changed, and yet it seems like nothing has changed. It seems that their ceiling of brutality continues to be raised every single day. The ceiling of their massacres, the creativity with which they conduct their massacres, in the aid lines, in the hospitals, in the refugee tents, continues to be heightened. And yet the ceiling of our courage, the ceiling of our boldness, our bravery is lowered. We expect of each other way less, and we commend each other for very little. We commend one another for doing very, very little. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about what is expected of people and what are the pressure points and what so on. But I will say that it is heartbreaking that after 2 years of genocide, we are still yet to call it a genocide. We are still yet to completely denounce and renounce Zionism as a racist settler colonial ideology that needs to be exterminated, eradicated from the world. There is no redeeming it, not in a cultural sense, not in a social sense, in no sense, because there is no redeeming white supremacy. In the same way, there is no redeeming Nazism, and there's no redeeming racism. And we cannot continue to allow Zionism to be exceptionalized and coddled in the Western world.
Thank you, Mohammed, for those very heartfelt words. And just to put some numbers on this, The Economist recently, which obviously is not exactly a left-wing publication, said that up to 109,000 people have died as a direct result of the violence in Gaza, and that doesn't even include the since October 7, 2023, of course, and that doesn't include the so-called indirect cases, which could be many, many times higher as a result of destroyed health infrastructure and so on. Yanis, could I ask, just to linger a bit more on this issue of the international reaction and the sense, at least, that the Overton windows is shifting a little. What role, if any, has public pressure played, do you think, in this?
At the risk of angering some of our comrades, let me say that the pressure that we have exerted on our authorities has been nowhere near sufficient. You know, we like to pat ourselves on the back that we demonstrate and we stage protests outside embassies. And some of those protests were quite large, especially in London and in other places. But, folks, it's nothing compared to the magnitude of the crime against humanity which is being perpetrated in Palestine. When the Eurovision Song Contest is allowed to take place, and we haven't managed to shut this down. Not only have we not managed to shut it down, but, you know, the Israeli entry, which was a clear, I mean, it's got nothing to do with singing and dancing. It was a clear Zionist ploy to put on a show of complicity and cheerleading for the IDF. And it wins the public's vote. And it wasn't rigged. Of course, you know, people who vote for the Eurovision are a subsample of the European public opinion. But still, you know, Israel is committing in real time on live television, or at least TikTok and Instagram and so on, live social media, a genocide. And the furor that we are creating is, I do not believe that it is proportional to the crime that is being committed. So yes, there's been pressure, but not enough. I go to demonstrations in Athens, and I can tell you, because, you know, I have the benefit of old age. You know, I'm in my mid-60s now, and I remember demonstrations about this, that, and the other, including demonstrations for Palestine. I mean, I happened to be in a demonstration for Palestine in 1982 in the center of Athens, at the time when what Israel is now doing to Gaza, it was doing to South Lebanon and Beirut. It was a time when the enemy was not Hamas, it was the PLO, Fatah, and Arafat and his warriors. And I remember there were no less than 800,000 people in the center of Athens in support of the Palestinians. We have not reached these numbers. My country, and I mention my country because it is my country, what can I do? Is complicit, totally complicit. Right-wing governments, social democratic governments, and the left-wing government in which I was a minister, well, to my defense, they only did it after I resigned, but nevertheless, they hugged and kissed with Netanyahu and signed commercial and defense offense deals that effectively rendered Greece a Zionist outpost. And we have done nothing as a movement, as a political agglomeration in order to counter that. Even the parties of the opposition in Greece's parliament, which signed a document condemning Netanyahu and so on and so forth, they didn't condemn themselves for having been complicit in all these commercial and military deals when they were in government. They have not done a mea culpa to say, you know what, we shouldn't have done that. It was a mistake. And they are not calling for a total embargo of Israel. So, even the center left, even the parts of the left, I mean, to think that Die Linke in Germany, our comrades in Germany, were going hand in hand with those who were banning DiEM25 from staging our Palestine Congress last year. You had Die Linke politicians who were signing with the FDP, with the SPD, with the CDU, and so on, documents that were presenting us as terrorist enablers. So, no, we Europeans, especially we progressives who are on the side of the Palestinians, we have no right to congratulate ourselves for the resistance we've put up. We have been below the level at which we would be in a position to say, yes, we've done our bit. We have not done our bit.
Thank you, Yanis. Mohammed, what would you say to that? Do you think that activism for Palestine has done its bit and has brought about any of these changes, or is it just the realities are shifting? And as Yanis said earlier at the beginning, that maybe they feel like now is the time when they need to take a different stance.
It's a hard question to tackle because you don't want to rain on people's parade or kind of demoralize them. But the honest truth is that just by looking at the situation in Gaza, we can see that our efforts have not been successful. And if we are just assessing our efforts by kind of the sentiment change around the world that hasn't yet translated into any kind of systematic or institutional change, then we also understand that we have failed. I operate both in the Arab world and in the Western world, and there's kind of a dichotomy that's always at play. Arab people love to say, and Palestinians love to say, look at the West, look at how many thousands are in the streets protesting for Gaza, because this is kind of unmatched in Arab countries. And the key context here is that people protest here because they can. And I wonder how much of these protests would occur if they were without permits, if they didn't have the kind of in the United States, the First Amendment rights that they had here. And I think with Egypt and Jordan and other, repressive regimes that have kind of banned and disallowed any kind of protest for Gaza, the issue between the different kind of peoples here in these geographies is not an issue of like the different bravery and what so on, but it's a different of policy. And I think we understand the open valve theory, the idea that people should be allowed to let off some steam in order to prevent revolution. And I think I thought with the coming and with the inauguration of Trump and the kind of crackdown on freedom of speech, the kind of crackdown on student movements here in this country, and I'm sorry to be just to bring it in to the United States context. I thought with this kind of crackdown there would be a rebellion, but unfortunately, it's as though people have not learned anything about the way fascism operates, and people have retreated. I know stories from people who are journalists who like worked for a summer in Beirut who have decided to take off Lebanon from their LinkedIn because they didn't want to be targeted, as if that's a rational fear to have. I've thought about people who I've heard about people who are now afraid to speak Arabic on the phone in the street, people who have changed their names, stuff like this. All of this preemptive obeying of fascism, all of this ceding ground to fascism without understanding that whatever ground we concede today we will not recover is really, really disappointing. And this elevation of the self and the personal safety over the collective liberation has been really disappointing. But I also want to think about another aspect of the failure of, I don't want to call it the failure, but the limitations of the solidarity movement here. If we are seeing day and night images of children incinerated, limbs hanging from ceiling fangs, people being blown to bits in their hospital beds, journalists, about 300 journalists murdered in broad daylight all the time. We understand then the issue around the world is not ignorance, and the issue is not about raising awareness. And so much of the work that we need to be doing needs to be done internally, inside our own communities. And particularly the example I'll use, and again, sorry to zero in on a US context, but the example I'll be using is there needs to be discord, internal discord within the Jewish community. This is absolutely beyond necessary and beyond late at this point. There is not one single Jewish institution or any single facet of Jewish life that is not in cahoots with the Israeli government. And of course, and absolutely, the Israeli government works overtime to synonymize Judaism with Zionism, but it falls on the shoulders of progressive Jews to make that conflation, to render that conflation absolutely explicit and rejected. And yet you walk into any random synagogue and you find the Israeli flag soaring in it. You have Jewish activists who come to our protests who then go to dinner and have dinner with their uncles and aunts who work in the ADL and the JNF and so on and so forth. We've read history, and we understood that Algeria and South Africa and all of these places were not just liberated or decolonized through the sheer will of their people. That was absolutely the most important aspect of it, but it was also discord within the colony itself and internal ruptures within the colony itself. And yet here, as people are being burnt alive in their hospital beds, as people are being starved to death as a weapon of war waged by the Zionist regime, you have prominent Jewish progressive organizations and organizers who still talk about the dangers of ostracizing Zionists, the dangers of rejecting Zionism, or the importance of understanding the nuances of Zionism, as if they would extend any of this nuance or complexity or grace to Nazism or white supremacy. These are things that are unforgivable. Now, of course, Jewish society is not the only party here to blame for the genocide, and this critique can be extended again to academia. How does it feel for us as people who are outside of the academy, who have been informed by the academy, by so-called revolutionary thinkers in the academy, to watch them not only retreat and concede ground and cower, but actively condemn the resistance that they so fiercely write about in their theoretical papers? And I will name names, for example. I thought it was almost cartoonish and a caricature to see that the co-author of Decolonization is Not a Metaphor go out of her way to release a statement denouncing and condemning the colonial work and political violence done by the Palestinian resistance. So Gaza, in a lot of ways, it has revealed all of these contradictions that are capable of driving a sane person crazy, be it in academia, be it in our allyships, in the circles of our allies, be it in churches, in cultural institutions here, for example, in New York. But the task isn't just to point out the double standard or to point out the kind of absurdity, but to also draw a clear line in the sand to reject this kind of duplicitous behavior. You cannot be in solidarity with the Palestinian people while actively keeping ties and maintaining relationships with the people dehumanizing us. And I will say just one more thing about the fact that so many people, it seems, are finally turning the corner, are finally, without any humility, without any recognition, without any acknowledgement of wrongdoing, are finally saying that what's happening in Palestine is a genocide. And it isn't because they are a moral compass of some sorts, or because they have a postponed or a belated moral clarity emerging from within them. But it's because it's finally safe to call it a war crime. It's finally safe to call it unacceptable and reprehensible. And there's an economy for that. There's an economy in the suffering of the Palestinian people. Now there is room for people to write books and lectures and make art about the genocide of the Palestinian people, make sculptures about Palestinian corpses, and win awards too late and 2 years after a genocide has started. I think, we want to have as broad as a coalition possible, of course, and we need to welcome people into our movement with open arms. But I think we also should be wary and cautious of opportunists and cautious of people who are not honest in their allyship. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mohammed. I'll just read out a couple of quick comments, reactions to what you've been saying, both of you, from people in the chat. Eric says there's a sense in the US that, at least here, that public protest, whether peaceful or not, on Palestine has zero impact. Patricia says, but some protest is better than no protest. However, it needs to be ramped up. Kirk Doherty's, again, referring to the US, too many refuse to leave the two-party monopoly and continue to drink the Kool-Aid of the mainstream news media. David Nathan says war crimes are not war. And Alisa reminds us that every single genocide scholar has said that what's going on is a genocide. And Chris Fisher says Israel's is a military machine under the direction of evil who are slaughtering lightly armed people with all the might of a modern army. It's not a war, it's an atrocity, and it's sick. Yanis, can I pass it to you for your reaction to what Mohammed said?
3 points in reaction to Mohammed. Very important contribution. The first one concerns our DiEM25 Jewish comrades. And the good news there, Mohammed, is that these particular people, the people who helped us organize the Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in the Middle East, that's a Berlin-based or German-based Jewish organization. People like Iris Hefetz, who's appeared on this program, and Udi Ratz, and our great comrade David Adler, and so on. These are, Jewish comrades, Mohammed, that have been totally demonized and sidelined by not just the Zionist segment of Jewish communities, but also by liberal, progressive Jews who have not made the complete break that you've been asking for, and which every anti-racist must make. So there have been, and there are, and these are our best comrades, Jews that were prepared to call a spade, and essentially to be jettisoned from Zionist, tolerant Jewish communities, and they deserve our praise. That's the first comment. The other two, I think, extend the points that Mohammed already made, the very good points. The first one is concerns resistance, as opposed to victim worshipping. even those who are lamenting the genocide, who are presenting no holds barred the tragedy that befalls people in, especially in Gaza, but not just in Gaza, in Jenin, in East Jerusalem, and so on, in Bethlehem, they tend to present the Palestinians as victims. Photograph after photograph of bodies of maimed children and so on. This is important to show to the world. But there is a danger there, that they are presented as victims. When what is really going on, at least that's how I understand it, is yes, there are victims, but there is also something far more important. There is resistance. And the spirit of resistance of the people of Gaza has not been shattered. It has not been bent to the Zionist machine's will. And that is something that I don't see, for instance, on Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera does a lot of good work, but it doesn't present the Palestinians as fighters, as resistance, a resistance movement. And that is something we need to do. And my final point concerns the extent to which we have the courage to look at what's happening within the Palestinian community and the Arab world. There is nothing that is more morally and spiritually depressing than watching the complicity of the Palestinian Authority, especially in the West Gaza, in the West Bank, and in East Jerusalem, their complicity to the Israeli war machine. That has always been the case. In the Nazi occupation of my country, of France, of Poland, of the bits of Russia that the Nazis got, the worst has been done not so much by the Nazis, but by their collaborators. It is essential that this is not for me because I'm not a Palestinian, this is for Palestinian comrades to do. It is important to isolate the complicity within the various institutions, especially in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. I know this is a very sensitive subject because we need to hammer out a sense of unity and solidarity amongst all Palestinians, but there is complicity. And, there always is complicity. Whenever there's an occupation, there are collaborators. Whenever there is oppression, there are members of the oppressed class that participate in the reproduction of oppression. Let's not forget that in South Africa, most of the policemen were black. The ones who were attacking the ANC-inspired resistance in Soweto and so on. This is the case wherever there is white settlement, where there is colonialism, where there is fascism, whenever there is Nazism, and of course where there is Zionism. But I think at some point we need to talk about it. Of course, I have to keep my mouth shut about these things once I make the suggestion that we talk about this and allow, Palestinians to lead this conversation.
Thank you, Yanis. And Mohammed, I would love your reaction to that. And while we're on the subject of what can be done, also to ask you, this sort of narrative shift, this space which is opening up, is there anything that activists, artists, organizers in the West can do to turn this drip into more of a stream, to reframe anti-Zionism as a legitimate moral stance, as that seems to be, those dynamics seem to be going in that direction, to take advantage of what's currently happening? Mohammed.
Yeah, I mean, two things first of all, about, Yanis, I think you're absolutely right about collaborators, and this has been true in every single colonial context in the world. There's always a comparator class. And I don't think actually it is just a conversation for Palestinians. I think it's just a conversation. And I think, in fact, it is this, the genocide has opened rooms, small spaces for sympathy with Palestinians, spaces that I think can be exploited by Palestinians who are apoliticized or counter-political, who work if they're not like straight up collaborators or spies with the Israeli regime, who work with a liberal world order that is interested in maintaining and rehabilitating Zionism. And this is why it's important to kind of always be critical of identity politics and the kind of elite capture that may accompany it, that may allow the elite classes to take advantage of these niches in progressive circles that are opening up and that are eager for Palestinian participation or Palestinian contribution. The issue of collaboration within Palestinian society can be, and this is maybe like a sensitive topic that we don't really talk about in English as much, but we have no tolerance for spies in Palestinian society. But a lot of the time, those people who become spies or who become informants are hungry people, poor people whose hunger and poverty is exploited by the Israeli regime, or people who have been sexually blackmailed by the Israeli regime. And of course, we have no tolerance for them. And I think the fundamental issues of poverty and hunger should be addressed, and thus these following consequences would be addressed. But I think so much it is the collaborators who work in high-tech companies, the collaborators who work in Israeli institutions, the collaborators who wine and dine with their Israeli friends, who have business deals with them, who kind of get away with it scot-free. The collaborators who, under the name of diplomacy, get to normalize the occupation, get to normalize Zionism, who we do not meet with the same wrath that we offer the hungry informants. And of course, it's not at all a justification of collaboration or becoming an informant or snitching on your brothers and being responsible for the killing of innocents. This is not at all an endorsement of it. But I think we need to employ, in our understanding of collaboration, in our understanding of Palestinian society dynamics, we need to employ a class lens in the way we kind of assess these dynamics. Because so often it is the bourgeoisie, the elites, the people who are highly educated that get to live in these narrow and dark nuances of what they call diplomacy or what they call professionalism and what they call civil society and so on and so forth, that allow them these kind of gray spaces to operate both as collaborators and as mediators between us and our oppressors. And that could be, an hour-long conversation, but it is beyond atrocious to me that 2 years after a genocide has started, and 77 years after a settler colonial regime continues to persist in our land, we still have scholars and writers who are not only eagerly accepting the invitations to work with Israeli publications and Israeli universities, but are desperate for their approval, desperate to be with them. And with offering them their likeness, they offer them also legitimacy by being the Palestinian token in those groups. I spoke so much about this that I forgot the second question.
It was more about what can be done. I mean, what would you say to the solidarity movement in the West in terms of how to exploit this shift which is happening, and how to reframe anti-Zionism as something which is a legitimate stance to have?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. We don't know what's happening behind the scenes, right? We don't know if I mean, maybe it's a cynical read, but we don't know if for example, the kind of like rhetorical changes, the very, very slight rhetorical changes in like the official UK, France, German stances are things that are rehearsed behind the scenes and are orchestrated to kind of allow people to let off some steam or whatever. But we should know that with every slight positive change, our efforts need to triple. If they give us an inch, we should be asking for a lot more. We should be greedy and entitled in the kind of demands we have. And in terms of treating Zionism, anti-Zionism as the correct, upright moral stance, we should just treat it as such. I think Zionism, and I think racism at large, has almost a genius feature about it, that it operates with such an entitlement, and it assumes that it is the correct moral stance. It just assumes that it is on the right side of history. This kind of entitlement is what allows a group like UK Lawyers for Israel, for example, to call and complain about children's artwork in a hospital in London and demand it be removed because it makes Jewish patients feel unsafe, and have that hospital indeed obey and remove that artwork. It is precisely that entitlement, that boldness of their racism, that allows them to render a chant like "From the River to the Sea" genocidal and a anti-Semitic dog whistle. Because so much of world opinion is not shaped by facts. It's not shaped by the truth. It's not shaped by statistics. It is shaped by what is compelling. Because affect is socially contagious, and people see Zionists appalled at our very righteous actions, and they think that our very righteous actions are appalling. And thus, this is something that we can apply ourselves. If we treat Zionism as this kind of debatable, disputable topic that we can deal with rationally, then ultimately it's a debatable, disputable topic that can be dealt with rationally. As opposed to, if you reject it outright, if you are bold and courageous about your stance, if you have no doubt and no fear and no shame about where you stand in your anti-Zionism, then that is how you shape public opinion. I like to use the analogy of cavities and rotting teeth. These people in the West, Zionists, be they evangelical Zionists or Jewish Zionists or whatever, are not very well in the head. They're not very well. And of course, some of them have fears and paranoias that are real, maybe not legitimate, but real. But most of these fears and paranoias are exploited by Zionist civil society, like the ADL and so on and so forth, or their collaborators and mercenaries in the West, to crack down on Palestinian speech, to crack down on Palestinian rights, and so on and so forth. And their fears are like, a second Holocaust is coming, or Palestinians want to throw Israelis into the sea, and so on and so forth. And instead of ridiculing these absolutely ridiculous claims, we give them the time of day. We debunk with rationality and logic what is extremely irrational and illogical, and thus we render it a legitimate argument. But when you have a child who has cavities, you don't reward these cavities with more candy. You take them to the dentist. And this is what we need to do with Zionists. We cannot coddle them. We cannot coddle their fears and their feelings, no matter how real they are. The only answer, intelligible solution, is treating the cause at the root, is abolishing Zionism, which is equivalent of taking a child with cavities to the dentist, because the more you're going to allow these fears, these fake pseudo-manufactured fears to fester, the more you're going to suffocate your own movement. There is, again, I've said this maybe 10 times thus far on this stream, forgive me, but there is no room for nuance with Zionism. There is no rehabilitation of Zionism. That is the enemy number one.
Thank you, Mohammed. As we get to the end of our hour here, Yanis, I'd like to ask you. You have argued in the past that Europe could choke Israel's war machine very quickly if it really wanted to. While we're on the topic of what can be done, especially to urgently address the humanitarian catastrophe that is unfolding, what do you think are the concrete steps for meaningful action from governments and institutions in the West?
Well, that's an easy one, Maren. The answer is in an acronym: BDS: boycott, divest from Israel, and sanction. If Europe were prepared to do that, then even if America didn't follow suit, then that would be a major blow. Major blow. Don't forget that 1/3 of munitions are coming from Germany alone. Leonardo, the Italian corporation, is providing them with much of their drone technology or equipment that they need for their own Israeli manufactured drones. The Danish company Maersk is handling almost 100% of all commercial and military imports and exports to Israel. So, Maersk on its own, just Maersk, a Danish company, from a country that supposedly is gung-ho about human rights. they could just choke Israel tomorrow. It would. I don't think the Americans would have the capacity to replace the import-export transportation services that Maersk is offering Israel. Let me give you just another example. The European Union common budget has provided in recent years 2,000 million euros for research, 2 billion euros, right? 2,000 million euros. I'm putting it in 2,000 million to make people, conceptualize that humongous sum. They provided through the Horizon Project program research and development monies to the Israeli military industrial complex. All right. So even the announcement that we are cutting them off as Europeans, as the European Union, would really put the cat amongst the pigeons in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem and so on. So there's a lot we can do. But if I may comment on what Mohammed said, Mohammed, you're absolutely right. In the same way that, look, the way I see Zionism is at a larger scale, the way that I see the Golden Dawn Nazi Party here in Greece. Anybody who says to me that being anti-Golden Dawn is to be anti-Greek, I just laugh in their face. Indeed, what I say is exactly the opposite. To be Golden Dawn is to be anti-Greek. Similarly, to be Zionist, you're anti-Jewish. Zionism has done an enormous amount of damage to the Jewish way of life, to Judaism, to progressive Jews, to Jews who do not want to be associated with a white settlement project. But Mohammed, allow me just to say something which I'm sure you know, but I'm saying it for the benefit of our audience who may not have heard me say this. It's something I say often. Look, Zionism is just a mere extension of European white settler ideology. So, what did the British do in Australia? Exactly what the Zionists want to do to Palestine. They looked at the land, they wanted it. They declared it terra nullius, that is a land without a people, for a people without a land. And that was the first step towards eradicating the First Nations people, the Aborigines. This is what the British did in South Africa. This is what they did in Kenya. This is what the Germans did in Namibia. This is what the French almost did in Algeria. They would have completed the story, the project had they not been stopped. But yeah, so in a sense, the Zionists, what are they telling the Europeans who maintain a psychological and political and moral connection to the white European settlement project? What they're saying to them is that, what are we doing differently to what you did? And if we are going to be stopped, well, maybe some, white farmers in Australia will have to give up their land to, the very few First Nations people who remain alive. And therefore, when take for instance, Afrikaner supporter of apartheid, the very people that Donald Trump now is taking under his wing and is even giving them asylum in the United States now, right? I'm not talking about all the Afrikaners, because a lot of them have completely accepted the new post-apartheid system. But the ones who didn't accept and who are remaining nostalgic of apartheid, every time they hear any politician, any citizen talking about equality in South Africa, they immediately think, oh my God, we have looted that land from the people of this part of the earth, and now we may lose it. So the word equality, Mohammed, well, when we say we want equality from the river to the sea, then, settlers immediately understand, rightly, that the land they have stolen may be taken back from them. So for them, it's so easy to make the mental leap and to say, they want to genocide us. Because they understand that equality is not consistent with their continued occupation of land that they have stolen. So, the European collective guilt resonates fully with the Zionist logic. And this is why you're absolutely right. We need to sever any connection between Zionism and Judaism, between being a Jew and being a Zionist. One is as related to the other as in the case of my country. You can say that to be a Greek means you have to be a Nazi member of the or supporter of Golden Dawn.
Thank you, Yanis. Yes, Zionism, the last settler colonial project of our time. And Mohammed, I would like to end with you, to your reaction to what Yanis has said, and also any final thoughts on the discussion that we've had today. I think you're muted, Mohammed.
Fair. I think we can go back and forth, but I think the most important point is that there is a lot to be done that hasn't yet been done. The fact that not a single Western country has expelled the Israeli ambassador yet is astonishing and shocking. And that is the absolute bare minimum. The fact that not one Israeli embassy has yet to be closed down is shocking. And what we are demanding isn't just that. We're demanding arms embargoes. We're demanding complete severing of ties with the Israeli regime. We're demanding a complete, not only halt, but ban of weapons sales, and severance of all diplomatic, economic, and social, and academic, and cultural ties with the Israeli regime. That is the only acceptable solution. Now, obviously, a lot of us here are not in government. Maybe the FBI guy that watches my streams is, but most of us are not in governments. But there is something to be done at the local level. There is something to be done at the grassroots level. So many of us still work in organizations that maintain somewhat of a cultural or academic tie with the Israeli regime. Some of us still have supermarkets in our neighborhoods that carry settler produce. And there is something to be done about those things. Obviously, each of us has to do an assessment of their own power, of their own class positionality, of their own risk, of what they have on the line before engaging in any kind of direct action or any kind of even rhetorical action. But it is important that we engage in some kind of action. I think since we are closing, I think it's important to remind myself, before I even remind others, that optimism is a political obligation. It's not a feeling. It's not something that you wait to be bestowed by God or by whatever divine power before you begin your work in organization or in shaping public discourse and so on and so forth. But it's your absolute obligation to be optimistic, to believe in your decolonial or anti-colonial project, in your liberationist project. It's an obligation. One, because we don't have the luxury of despair, we don't have the luxury of cynicism. And two, because the resilience of people on the ground should bring us all to shame about the kind of comfort we live in and the kind of defeatism we allow ourselves. This isn't, again, to demoralize anyone who is listening. And it is really beautiful to see so many people on the right side of history, who continue to be on the right side of history, who continue to wage difficult battles in their own personal spaces. But it is important for us to raise the ceiling. This is ultimately what I believe in our very limited, small capacity as individuals. We can at least raise the ceiling of what is permissible. We can at least say the quiet part out loud. We can at least be unafraid and eager to ruffle people's feathers, to make racism unwelcome and uneasy in our gatherings. So much of us, particularly academics and thought leaders or so-called thought leaders, are quick to pile on students when they make quote-unquote rhetorical mistakes or they say something wrong. So many of us are quick to demand politeness in the suffering of our victims, demand from our victims a perfect script when they talk to television producers. And I think it's a far more effective and productive technique to back our people and to back our base no matter what, to hold their back and to always punch up instead of punching down. to focus on the collaborators, to focus on the people who are in bed with our murderers, to focus on our murderers themselves and on their mercenaries, rather than focusing on tone policing and, I don't know, training our own bases into some kind of perfect script and a perfect way of direct action or perfect way of boycott. If anything, I have learned so much from Zionism, I hate to admit. And I think the most valuable lesson has been that we need to be entitled. We need to be so entitled in what we believe in what we know to be true. We cannot cower in the face of fascism, in the face of authority. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Mohammed. Optimism is a political obligation. Very, very well said. Some final comments from you guys in the chat. Dr. Musa says Zionism is the same idea as apartheid, seeing another human as subhuman. And Random User says Israel wants all the land. That's all it's ever been about since day one. They've always seen Palestinians as below them since day one. And Violin, on the note of activism and what we can do, says everyone has a unique skill set. Use it. Well, thank you so much to our panel and to you out there. Thank you, Mohammed. It's been a real treat having you on our live stream. And there's really so much to unpack in everything you've said. Really appreciate the time you've given us here tonight. If you guys out there would like to support DiEM25, we have no big backers, then go to diem25.org/support if you would like to join us and try and make some of the things that we've talked about actually happen, especially on Palestine. We're very active, especially on that front. Then please go to diem25.org/join. Thank you again to our panel and to you out there. And we will see you at the same time, same place, 2 weeks from now. Take care